I'm going to hand over to my guys, let them introduce themselves.
Thanks, Neil. Hi, everyone. My name is Manas. Welcome to today's session. We're going to talk about how to configure hybrid business connectivity services. I work with SharePoint Online Escalation Services. With me is Sam and Neil.
Hi, everyone. Sam Hassani. I'm a principal consultant for Brightstar in the UK. So I spend most of my time working with customers, building and planning SharePoint solutions, both on-premises and online, and sometimes a combination of the two.
Thanks, Sam. My name's Neil Hodgkinson. I'm a program manager in the Office 365 CAT team, which is a customer advisory team. So we spend a lot of time working with both on-premises and 365 customers, helping them through some challenging issues, should we say. In my former life, I've been at Microsoft for 10 years. In my former life, I was an explosions chemist or an explosives chemist. So no difficult questions, or you might find yourself going out the room without legs. For this session, then, it's BCS. We're talking about hybrid BCS, and the idea is just to give you a few objectives here of the things that we want you to take away from this session. Right? We want you to gain an understanding of general business connectivities, how it works, how we can speak to OData, and how we can read and write to OData to enhance line of business systems and give you a presence in the cloud, something with BCS, which is traditionally thought of more of as an on-premises implementation. We're going to look at the infrastructure, the key configuration elements, how you actually deploy and build and configure a BCS environment in a number of different ways, not just a pure Office 365 to SharePoint on-premises configuration. We're going to look at things with Azure as well, and we're going to look at possibly some other bits and pieces as hopefully bonus sessions at the end. We'll see how that goes. Key takeaway, though, is to give you the skills, to give you the capability to have discussions with your own customers, to have discussions with your own teams and your own IT people in terms of how you actually implement this capability. Agenda we're going to go through. We're going to give you an overview. We want to get quite deep if we can, but we've got to give you an overview first to give you kind of the basic building blocks to see how we work in the hybrid world and what hybrid means to us, both at Microsoft and with our partner community and with yourselves as partners and customers. Like I said already, key concepts are critical. So there's a number of key configuration, a number of key things you absolutely need to get right. And if you get one of them wrong, the whole thing falls to pieces and doesn't work. So we've got to make sure we cover all of those elements for you. And then we're going to look at a pseudo real-world example of how you can use BCS in combination with hybrid capabilities to kind of enable and empower your workforce. So let's begin with an overview. If we think about hybrid generally, and I'm probably sick of hearing the word hybrid this week, and you certainly will be, I know, by the end of the week. Hybrid is a big play for Microsoft, certainly this year. And as we start to release our new products, you're going to see hybrid all of the time. There's several, I don't know, maybe tens of sessions at this conference. And for Microsoft, when we're thinking about hybrid scenarios, I think if we go back kind of 12 months or 18 months, we always thought of hybrid as being kind of the first step towards a fully immersive cloud experience. So we want you to, you're walking into the cloud, you're going to go hybrid first, then you're going to forget hybrid and you're going to be 100% in the cloud. I think today, more often than not, we think of hybrid as more of a steady state. And hybrid is something that's going to exist for a long time. Whether it exists as a long time because it's a migration process that you're going through, and you might have lots of content, lots of applications you want to onboard into the cloud ultimately, and hybrid is your stepping stone to get there. Or it may well be that you simply have applications that you have never imagined you can get to the cloud and maybe never even will ever be there. So we need to have you with this capability to do hybrid enablement for maybe for the lifetime of your company. It could be a long time. So when we're thinking about that hybrid scenario, we need to think about things like, you're going to hear a lot about hybrid search this week, and the one thing that we're going to cover specifically in this session, as the session title denotes, is BCS. Now with BCS, we're really thinking about enabling our companies, enabling our customers and partners, and our workforce to discover and use the data that we have locked away sometimes in on-premises line of business applications and expose it into the cloud, to traditionally expose it in Office 365 in our case. And there's three core scenarios we need to think about with BCS. There's the on-prem configuration. On-premises configuration, even when we're thinking hybrid, is critical. Without the on-premise implementation of BCS, you can't make BCS work in the cloud in one of our scenarios. We're going to talk about some other ones. Then there's the whole concept of having this hybrid infrastructure. So with hybrid, we're using BCS in Office 365. We're using BCS on-premises. We're using them to talk to each other through a series of implementation steps that we're going to take you through to enable that exposure of data from on-premises into Office 365. And then the one we're going to talk about more towards the end is the concept of cloud only. So in this case, we're talking about companies who may have moved their line of business data into Azure, for example, using Azure SQL. Maybe they're doing a pump of data into Azure SQL on a regular basis, and they want to expose that data in Office 365, either through external content types or applications. So before we can do any of this, we need to get the building blocks right. So I'm going to hand over to Manas to talk through identity.
Thank you, Neil. So we heard from Neil that when we talk about business connectivity services, the primary factor for when you look into any data is identity, right? Because all of this data, when you look at it, it has to be rendered in a secure manner. So a couple of questions come up whenever we talk about rendering the data. Are we trying to go ahead and access it from an identity which resides in the cloud, or an identity which resides today in your on-premises environment? The moment we say hybrid, the first thing which comes up is common identity, or the same identity being leveraged wherever you log in from. So let's take a step back and look at what are the various types of identities which exists when it comes to Office 365. Primarily 3 types. One is the cloud identity, and when we correlate it back to what type of BCS connection you would be able to do with it, the answer would be cloud only, and we will come into a little more details around why that. The second type of identity which comes in is when you synchronize your on-premises users back to Office 365 using either directory synchronization or Azure Active Directory Sync. Brings in the same identity over to Office 365 Azure AD, and you would be able to look at the same data which is either in on-premise or in SharePoint Online. Of course, to enhance the sign-in experience, you would be able to deploy ADFS, which is the single sign-on, and hence the user, the way he retrieves the data enhances from a sign-in perspective, and it gets to see the single sign-on experience. So when we look at these 3 types of identities, how does BCS, and the way BCS is being looked into, how does it affect all of this? So the primary things which needs to be done is Office 365 Azure AD needs to know which identity is coming in order to render the data, or before it could render the data. So you have to synchronize the users, and the supported synchronization mechanism is either directory synchronization or Azure AD Sync, when you would be able to go ahead and synchronize the user to Azure AD, assign licenses. You need to actually ensure that the security token service, the certificate within it, is replaced so that you'd be able to set up a server-to-server trust, which is the key for any of the inbound or hybrid, any of the hybrid scenarios to work, including BCS. Now, when we talk about this, setting up procedure, you definitely need to ensure that SharePoint Online is registered as an high-trust app for BCS to be able to go out and do. And the way we do it is you establish a server-to-server trust, and for every specific user that tries to retrieve the data, they are then authenticated, and the process we do that is called user rehydration. So when we say that user rehydration, what does it do? It basically needs to understand that the user which is sending the request, if that is an on-premises user, is indeed who it claims it is, which means when a request is being made from on-prem, the user identity is then gone back and compared with the user profile, for which it can then resolve the set of claims which are being sent, and the identity is constructed. Once the identity is constructed, that's when the data is being retrieved and rendered to the user in a browser. So remember, in all of this, it's quite easy when you are able to go ahead and access the resources. Now, when we say access the resources, I was talking to a gentleman the other day, and he was like, okay, well, accessing SQL Server. Remember, SharePoint, and in order for you to go ahead and do any of the business connectivity services, it has to be communicating over an OData, and Sam is going to go ahead and talk about it more. So when a request comes in from SharePoint Online, the primary thing which it looks for is the SharePoint on-premises endpoint, which means it needs to reach your SharePoint on-prem via some sort of reverse proxy or firewall. What is key out here, which I want to call out, is in order for you to go ahead and establish this connection, you would need a secure store. And for secure store, in order to communicate with the reverse proxy, primarily which will expose your on-premises SharePoint, you need to have a certificate which is from a public certification authority. So the secure store will go ahead and have a copy of the certificate, which is also stored in the reverse proxy, and they do a certificate authentication before the user rehydration process actually takes over. So other than that, when you set this up, okay, this is exactly how a setup or a topology would look like, which means on the screen, you see the Microsoft data center. Within it, you would be having the SharePoint online site collection, which would have either an app or a external list or some sort of ways to go ahead and render the data. When you see this, okay, it actually has gone back and communicated through a reverse proxy and has communicated back to the on-premises environment from where it is pulling up the data. And the key to it, other than the infrastructure configuration, is a certificate which it should be able to go ahead and do a certificate authentication. So I mentioned reverse proxy a couple of times. Okay, we have, I think, around 18 months back, we had done a reverse proxy validation for most of the reverse proxies which you see in this slide. We have a TechNet article which talks about what are the supported reverse proxies, but here are the common and documented reverse proxy solutions, which is TMG, Web Application Proxy, F5, Big IP, and there are other validated ones too. Okay, so what we have seen is, based on the standard set of reverse proxy guidelines which we have in the TechNet, reverse proxies should work, except for UAG, which does not go ahead and work for when you are trying to go ahead and do a inbound hybrid. So I mentioned about the infrastructure setup. Okay, let's take a quick look in order to ensure that if you have set up an infrastructure which is from a hybrid solution, is it even capable enough for you to go ahead and render the data to the set of users who would be making this request? Okay, and let me do a demo. So in this demo, what we are trying to go ahead and show you guys is we have an environment which is configured for hybrid infrastructure, pretty much what I spoke about a couple of minutes back, which means server-to-server authentication has been set up, and the users has been synchronized. So how do we validate certain steps? How do we configure it is well documented. How do we validate certain things? So when I say how do we validate certain things out in the screen, I just go ahead and try to zoom this to. Okay, so what you see here right now is a couple of variables which I'm defining. What I'm trying to do out here is, remember the certificate which I said for security token service in on-prem, which you need to change? The certificate there which you'd be using is a self-signed certificate. It works there, but for your reverse proxy, you would need a public certificate. So the first thing which I would validate whenever there is a specific error message where you are not able to retrieve is, of course, has the trust been properly set up? And the way we do that is we check the certificate thumbprint and ensure it's matching. So right now, as you see here, what I'm doing is I'm just going ahead and defining the certificates or pointing to the certificates in a variable. You see a GUID here, okay? This is the SharePoint Online App ID, which you go ahead and register so that you'd be able to go ahead and kind of do this hybrid communication. I'm defining this in a variable. What we do next is we are trying to go ahead and retrieve the certificate thumbprint and check that does the thumbprint match to the thumbprint which we see as a security token service certificate on-prem. And it shows this is the certificate which I have on this one. Okay. Well, nothing that is alarming at this stage. The second thing which you would do is, do we have a certificate which is expired? Because you could have set this up last year, and the validity is just for a year. Okay? How do you validate that? And we have the scripts in the slide, so you guys could take a look at it. But we do a get-msol service principal. In order to execute this commandlet, what you need to do is you need to authenticate against your Azure AD with a global admin account. And once we do this, okay, it has more than a set of values for the certificate. It should be able to go ahead and retrieve and tell you what's the start date, what's the end date. If you see an expired certificate, you already narrowed down the problem. Okay, replace the certificate. The second thing which kind of creates an issue is service principal names. Okay, now what's the ideal service principal name requirement? It should match your on-premises web application URL. Okay, so you can check with this set of commands, which is get-msol service principal, and list out the service principal names in context of the service principal for SharePoint Online, and see, ideally, we do not have duplicate SPNs. If we have one, we would get inbound 401 when you are trying to go out and do any of the hybrid workloads. Okay. Finally, is the user synced properly? As in, when was the last DIR sync ran, or when was the last Azure AD sync ran? Couple of things which you could do. Again, after you're authenticated, I'm trying to retrieve when was it executed. So last DIR sync was Monday, May 4, 2015, and it indeed has done the DIR sync properly. Well, does the user even exist? Like the CEO of our company, Bob Fox here, okay? Does he even stay, is he even online, right? Or is he even in Office 365 Azure AD for it because he is not able to access the BCS data? Yeah, he is there and he is licensed. So the final thing which you would check, or rather, one of the key things which you would check is, does all attributes of Bob shows up properly in the user profile service application? How do you validate that? This is for your on-premises environment. You can check the UPA status, and you can check if the UPA is online. It shows online. The final command which you should check, and ideally that should be the 90% of the problems which you see, which is on your on-premises, is the ACS proxy which you created, does that still exist? Is it broken? Or is it the trusted token issuer in your environment? Execute this. It shows ACS is online. If this is the scenario, your BCS should definitely work. So a couple of key things from a validation standpoint before I hand over to Sam to kind of take you through the configurations.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Manas. So hopefully you can all appreciate now we're at the point where our hybrid environment's configured. We have the trust relationship established between the on-premises environment and Office 365. So we can now start to think about configuring some of the hybrid workloads. So before we take you through the steps to actually go ahead and configure BCS, we thought it'd be worth just covering off some of the key concepts around BCS. And getting this stuff right is really, really important for two reasons. Firstly, you need to ensure that your on-premises environment is actually configured for BCS to work and function correctly. As Neil mentioned earlier, this is absolutely crucial for the hybrid process. And secondly, you obviously need to kind of take this knowledge and apply it to SharePoint Online too, to have an external list or an app in SharePoint Online, be able to use the BCS service to communicate back to a line of business application on premises. So quick raise of hands. How many of you use BCS today on premises? Okay, quite a few of you. So hopefully we can whiz through this pretty quickly. But what's fundamental to all of this is the concept of an external content type. So for those of you that haven't been through the BCS configuration process before, the external content type is really, really important, and it allows us to define the data structures that we want to connect to and security around that to a line of business application or a data source. And once we have this external content type defined and created, we can use that in some way, and it can be implemented in SharePoint using an external list to actually surface that data back in SharePoint, or we can actually bring that data back to SharePoint using an app. And hopefully we'll show you two different examples throughout the course of this session. One thing to point out here is that the BCS hybrid scenario only actually supports O data sources. So if you have a SQL server on premises or another data source, as long as that data source can be represented through an O data service, we can consume that through the BCS hybrid scenario. And consequently, to be able to actually create the external content types to be fed from an OData service, we need to use Visual Studio for that process. So if you've used SharePoint Designer in the past to create external content types, you wouldn't be able to do that for the BCS hybrid scenario. So as we mentioned, making sure that BCS is configured on premises is a prerequisite for all of this. You'll need to create the BCS service application, instantiate the corresponding service within your SharePoint environment. You'll then need to make sure that you have appropriate permissions assigned and configured within the metadata store so that your users can perform the required operations. And then you'll need to think about security. Are you going to use impersonations? So you define a particular account that can access your OData source within a secure store target application, which obviously will have the prereq of having the secure store service application being created, and create a mapping to different members within that target application. So the users that you want to be able to consume from that line of business data application can actually read that data and write back if that's a requirement. Once you've done all of that, you can go ahead and define that external content type using Visual Studio. And from there, you can then create an external list or an app for SharePoint 2013. So the process obviously needs to be in place for the hybrid scenario, but it's very, very similar for the online BCS scenario with some additional configuration steps, which we'll show you very shortly. But just thinking about the actual data flow within the on-prem scenario, because again, this becomes very relevant when you look to configure this for SharePoint Online. If you think about a user interacting with an external list, once the user makes that request, the external list will communicate with the BCS service application and actually retrieve the external content type. And that external content type will tell BCS where that data is and how we can retrieve the required data. So the BCS then can then pass a request to that data source using the secure store, if that's the chosen security method that we've defined. So optionally, with BCS on premises, you can actually take that external list that you may have configured offline using something like Outlook. And the same applies for the hybrid BCS scenario too. Okay, so when we think about hybrid BCS, we've kind of touched on this a little throughout the session already. But ultimately, what we can achieve is publishing a line of business data application in SharePoint Online and consuming that data in SharePoint Online. So enabling users that are outside of the firewall from within the organization that may be using SharePoint Online already for other purposes to actually see that data in SharePoint Online too. And as Manas touched on earlier, having DirSync in place is a requirement. So having the ability for that user rehydration process to take place is an absolute must. The topology that must be configured was demonstrated earlier on one of the slides that Manas showed, and this is what we call the two-way topology, where SharePoint Online trusts our on-premises environment, and our on-premises environment trusts SharePoint Online. Finally, we can only use an OData source, just to reiterate that point. Something else that you can consider, which we will come back to towards the end of this session, is actually consuming a data source that lives in the cloud, so something outside of your on-premises environment. And that could be SQL Azure. It doesn't necessarily have to be Azure. It could be some other cloud-hosted data source. And again, this would allow users to maybe consume data that isn't on-premises. And you can save yourself the effort of going through the rigorous process of everything we've just shown you around the hybrid infrastructure configuration. And in that scenario, the data flow is very, very similar. And as you'd expect, when the user interacts with a list or an app that's consuming this data feed, the list will obviously speak to BCS in SharePoint Online in this scenario. And SharePoint Online's BCS service will use the external content type that's been defined and uploaded there to understand how it can actually consume that data. Again, if we're using the secure store, which we would be, BCS will retrieve the credentials it needs to actually access that data source. And then BCS will be able to retrieve that data and present it back through the feed that it's received, SQL Azure in this case, and display it in the browser to the user. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Neil, who is going to expand on that and talk a little bit more about a real-world scenario and how you might apply this.
Thanks, Sam. So I get the easy bit. I get to talk about it. Sam's going to build it in a minute in a demo. So anyway, think about real-world scenarios. We've kind of come up with a bit of a contrived scenario here. Thinking about a situation, I guess we all have, many of us in our company is going to have sales folks out in the field. They want to talk to their line of business data. They need to be able to see what kind of target markets they need to go and be selling into, what customers they may have that are not buying anymore, or not buying as much as they should. So they want to go and get some data, pull some data out of line of business systems and see where they should be selling. So this gives us kind of a scenario where we're thinking, I want my mobile workforce out outside my company perimeter to be able to go and just access that data. Perhaps they're going to search for it as well, thinking about another hybrid scenario. We expose that data to them in Office 365. And then we allow them to not only read that data to find out the things they should be doing, but then to write back with that data as well. So they can update the data, update the sales figures, so the people back at the head office are retrieving the new information as well. So everybody's acting in the same playing field, and no longer do you have mobile workers out there carrying Excel spreadsheet printouts all around in their cars everywhere. So the solution that we're going to kind of build for you is fairly straightforward. If we think about our Bob here, our external user, called Bob, who's our salesman, he's going to use mechanisms of basically within a browser in Office 365 or perhaps through an app or a mobile app to talk to line of business data through Office 365. That line of business data, as I've already said, is updated by the workers back at the office, updated by the mobile workforce, so everybody's got this same synchronous experience. And hopefully this is what we're going to build. But there's a few things we need to do before we can make that happen. First thing we need to do, as Sam mentioned earlier, we need to make sure business connectivity services is deployed. We need that on premises. We need to make sure that we have the instance defined, so we need to know how we're going to connect to it. What's the configuration we're going to need to be able to connect to business connectivity services, both from the on-prem perspective for our internal workforce, and then when we think about configuring Office 365, we need to do some work out there as well. I've already mentioned the two-way authentication topology. And the key thing, as Manus mentioned earlier when we were talking about validation, the external URL. We're not going to talk directly from Office 365 to your line of business system. We're going to talk through services exposed by SharePoint. So it's your SharePoint URL that you need to have exposed to the internet in a secure manner. Then we think about how the data flow works in this scenario. It's similar to the ones that Sam's already talked through. In this case, we have a user. They log on. In this case, they're not going to an on-premises infrastructure like they did with the on-premises scenario. They're going to SharePoint Online. They're logging in, the federated user, and they make a request. They're looking for data. Clicker's freaking out. They're looking for data. So they make a call, and they're making a call to the SharePoint Online site. SharePoint Online site may have an external list on a page in that site, and that external list is defined by the external content types that Sam's going to show us uploading into Office 365, into the business connectivity services. Once we reach that external content type, or once the request is made via the external list, SharePoint Online, the BCS services there, knows what data you're looking for. It uses the external content type to do a number of things. First of all, to define which data source you want to connect to. What credentials do you want to use to reach it? We've mentioned Secure Store already and the ability to use certificate mapping in there to be able to reach the endpoint. It also pulls from the Secure Store the pre-authentication certificate that we're going to use to authenticate against the reverse proxy. So there's a number of things going on in the online scenario. Once we have that, we can then reach out and connect to our data source or connect to our external URL through the reverse proxy. So as I said already, when we hit the reverse proxy, we present that certificate for pre-authentication, which allows our request to go through to the on-premises infrastructure. Once we reach on-premises, this is the key thing. This is why we need BCS, BDC configured correctly on-premises as well, because it's at this point we're going to invoke the BCS application on-premises. And the BCS application on-premises, which knows, again, where the data is, knows what data it's looking for, will reach out, load the model, load the ECT, and use the right Secure Store configured credentials on premises to collect that data for you, and then the whole thing gets fed backwards up the chain back to the end user. So it's important, and the critical thing is to make sure your BCS is configured on both sides of that hybrid infrastructure. In order to configure the whole thing up, there's a couple of things we need to do. And typically there's these 6 steps that will allow you to have the configuration working. The first thing we need to do is we need this OData source. So Sam mentioned earlier that OData is the connectivity, or the data, the source, the protocol that we're going to use to connect to the data that we want to expose. And that's important. So we're going to create the OData source, we're going to create an external content type. We're going to do something called make the external content type tenant ready. And I'm going to walk you through some more detailed information on this. Making it tenant ready means it's available for use in Office 365 and it's configured to support Office 365 style connectivity in terms of how the BCS is configured. Then we're going to make a connection to the on-premises service. We're going to upload the ECT files, which, as we've already mentioned, defines the type of data we're looking for. And then we're going to create an external list, which is literally our validation process. We've done all the hard work, we've done the upload piece, we need to make sure we can actually see the data. So if we work through these in a little bit more detail. When we think about the first thing, creating the OData source. OData source, we're simply going to define it through Visual Studio. If you think back to BCS in 2010, we had a number of things, and indeed on premises today, we had a number of ways to connect to data sources, and we could use SharePoint Designer and Visual Studio. With OData, you're restricted to Visual Studio only. So it's fairly straightforward. We add our data entry, we add a WCF service, and then literally just configure the whole thing up to work. It's a very straightforward process. I'm not a dev, not by a long shot, and I can do this. Right? So there's no excuse for anyone in this room not to be able to do this, although I did break it the first time. Okay, the second thing we need to do is create the external content type. And this involves, we're basically going to use the definition that we've created by exposing our OData service to design the OData type that we're going to use. So imagine a scenario, we're going to expose a SQL server, a number of tables in SQL, in a SQL database. So the ECTs, external content types, are going to define all of those data, all of those entries within those tables. Which data is it we actually want to expose to our mobile workforce? Very, very straightforward. Configure it. Like I said, like I said already, I'm no dev and I can walk through this fairly easily. Then the other thing we need to do is this concept of making the file tenant ready. And now we're starting to get into a scenario which we're differing from on-prem. We're deviating from the on-prem configuration. Like a lot of you are using BCS already. When we make this file tenant ready, we have to remove a few things, we have to add a few things. Fundamentally what we're doing is we're modifying the connection strings within the tenant file so that we're telling the BCS services where to go to get the data. It's as simple as that. So it's a simple configuration. It's effectively a find and replace inside the file. As I said, you're going to show this in a demo, right, Sam? Yeah, so it's fairly straightforward, fairly easy to do. And then the next piece we need to look at, if this clicker works, is to actually create the connection itself. Now, when we're looking at creating the BCS connection, those of you that have worked in BCS on premises will know it's fairly straightforward. You upload your model, you configure your permissions, and you connect to it. In online, there's another thing you need to do. In online, we have this connection capability where we can define things like, is that readable? Yeah. We can define things like the authentication type we're going to use, the URL of our on-premises service that we're going to connect to. And it essentially allows us to define when a user connects to an external list, within our configuration file, we've defined which BCS connection entity we're going to call. This is where we define that entity. And then using the properties of this entity, such as the on-premises URL, such as the BDC model, and then the authentication piece will tell us how we're going to connect to that on-premises store. Typically, the one we would use in a hybrid configuration, in fact, will always be a secure store application. So we're going to go and make sure we connect out there using credentials stored in the on-premises secure store application. In terms of connection security, there's another few things you need to look at. When we're thinking about doing hybrid now, all of your on-premises SharePoint farms, 2013 farms, are all version 15, right? That's our DLL version. Office 365 is not. Office 365 is 16, is our DLL version. So you need to make sure you do this step, which is to add effectively an assembly binding redirect into your on-premises web.config file. If you miss this step, everything breaks. It's critically important to go through this process. And again, Sam's going to show where this is in the files. Final piece is to configure the metadata store permissions. So when we're thinking about configuring the ECT file, when we upload the ECT file, it's effectively just an XML definition. We upload it to Business Connectivity Services in Office 365, and then we have to define permissions as to who can manage it and who can use it. The first thing we do is configure the permissions for the admins. So we need to make sure we go in there and set which of our Office 365 administrators are going to be allowed to use this capability. And then we permission the users as well. And then we're pretty much done, right? So we're going through the process now. We're going to import the file. Have I gone out of step here? Sorry. Yeah, so we configure the permissions for the admins. Sorry about that. Once we've permissioned the permission for the admins, we need to make sure we then define which users can actually use the application. It's fine being able to administer it, but I want to make sure my mobile workforce out there who are going to be calling the application or calling the ECTs can then actually connect to that application and retrieve the data. So the final thing we need to do is log in and then apply those permissions. Or the fifth thing we need to do is log in and apply those permissions to make sure that all of those users that we want out there using it can actually do something with it, both read or write. And then the final thing we need to do is the validation piece. So at this point, we've configured our external content types. We've uploaded the file to SharePoint Online. We're already configured on premises. We've defined permissions to who can admin the connection, and we've defined permissions as to who can actually consume it. But the final thing we do then is create the external content type or create the external list. So now we're saying, okay, let's make sure this all works. Have we configured it properly? Have we built it correctly? Very, very straightforward. Go into your site collection, deploy the external content type app or the list, and then wait for it to render, and you'll get your results. And hopefully, if it's all configured up properly, you'll get to see the data and interact with the data and do some read-write. And with a demo, hopefully this will also going to work. It's over to Sam.
Okay, cool. So if we think back to the scenario that Neil outlined at the start of that section, we have our on-premises environment where we have a line of business system, and we've surfaced that data from that system in SharePoint in our on-prem environment. And that's what you can see here. So we have a kind of fairly bog-standard, out-of-the-box external list, which is speaking to an OData service using BCS on-prem. So this is all on-prem at the moment. And the OData service that we're consuming is hosted locally here. It's AdventureWorks service, and this is fronting a SQL database. And again, this OData service is only accessible internally. It's not published externally through our reverse proxy device or anything like that. Just to show you some of the other configurations, kind of expand on what Manas demonstrated in the earlier demo around the farm configuration here. If we firstly look at the endpoints that we have. So we have a web application called team.hassanionprem.com, and you can see that we've got two internal URLs for this web application, team and then team SPO. And if we look at what we've actually published through our reverse proxy device, so over here on my WAP box, so we're using web application proxy as our reverse proxy device, you can see that I've got two endpoints. Hopefully you can just about maybe see. The first is team.hassanionprem.com, which is configured for pass-through authentication. And this is the URL, the endpoint that users will actually access content through. So for example, if we were configuring inbound search, when we perform search requests from SharePoint Online to our on-premises environment, users would actually be displayed with results back to content on this URL, and they could then authenticate using whatever authentication mechanism SharePoint's using, because in this case, we're just allowing pass-through auth. But the interesting one is the endpoint below, which is configured for client certificate authentication. So the reverse proxy device has a copy of that certificate, which Manas mentioned is required for that SharePoint Online initial pre-auth request before users can actually retrieve any content from your on-prem environment. So if we go back over to our on-prem farm, and I'll show you a few other things. This one here. Service application-wise, we have the app management service application configured, there's secure store service application, and obviously BCS. So within our secure store service application, we've already created that target application, and that's how we're actually mapping credentials to the back-end OData source that we're retrieving data from. And pay attention to the name of that, because we're going to have to refer to this when we come to our online configuration. So we have OData app there. And within that, we've defined the members of this credential mapping. We also have BCS service application with the model uploaded, which contains the external content type from which we created this external list. So what I'm now going to do is jump over to SharePoint Online and walk through the process that Neil just described. And the first thing that we are going to do is create a new Secure Store target application. And the purpose of this Secure Store target application isn't really specific to the BCS workload configuration. It's more around that initial inbound pre-authentication process that Manas talked through. So I'm going to go ahead and create this. So click New here on the ribbon. And once this wakes up, so I'll give this a name of Ignite. Display name Ignite again. Put an email address in here. And then for field type, I'm going to specify certificate. And this is eventually, once the certificate has been uploaded, what SharePoint Online will present to our reverse proxy device when it makes those requests back to the on-prem farm. So if I hit OK, and because I've specified field type certificate, when I come back to this Secure Store target application of Ignite, set my credentials, it should prompt me to actually upload that certificate, which is already configured and associated with the endpoint that we've published through WAP. So for the username, which I didn't change the field label of, I could have put something a bit more meaningful there, choose a certificate, and because this is a PFX, I need to make sure that I type my password in correctly, and hit OK. So that's the first step. And we need to, again, remember the name of that ID, so Ignite. What I'm now going to do is come into the BCS section in our Online Admin Center. And here you can see there's a few different areas. And what we're going to do is manage connections to on-premises services. And here we create a connection which really defines how SharePoint Online is going to speak to our BCS service application on-premises. So again, if I add a new connection, and I'll give this guy a name. And in here, I need to put in the service address. So this service address is the OData service, which I showed you earlier. So I'm just going to copy it out of this notepad and whack it in here. And then for authentication, I'm going to specify that I want to use credentials stored in SharePoint on-premises. And this is where I now specify that Secure Store target application that I showed you in the on-premises Secure Store service application. And that's the same target application that we're using internally within our on-premises environment to render that external list and define permissions correctly. So the name of that, if my memory serves me correctly, was OData app. For authentication mode, I'm say impersonate Windows identity. And now I need to put in the internet-facing URL. And this is that endpoint that SharePoint Online uses for the pre-authentication. And it's teamspo.hassanionprem.com. But you need to append the client service to that URL. And that's described here in the description next to the field. And finally, I need to specify the client certificate that's going to be used for that initial pre-auth request. And that was the Secure Store target application that we just created, which hopefully, if I've spelled everything correctly, was just Ignite. So I'll go ahead and create that. So that should create, and that's the detail around the connection back to our on-prem farm. And now what we need to do is take an external content type and feed that detail into the external content type. And this relates back to what Neil talked about, making our EC2 tenant ready. So what I'll do is open up the external content type. In fact, it's a BDC model that I have here, which just contains a few different external content types. That's the only difference. And I'll call out a few things. So what I've done already here, I've pretty much just taken this external content type out of the on-prem environment that we saw earlier. But I've removed a couple of properties from line of business system and line of business system instance, the properties that Neil mentioned, so the metadata service URL and service URL. And we've added in this guy here, so OData connection setting ID. And that is the name of that OData connection that we just created. which again was Ignite. So I'm just going to replace the word test here with that. Just a little tip there, never create a connection with a space in the name, otherwise you'll be troubleshooting things for quite a while, involving a fair few Microsoft resources to get to the bottom of it as well.
Yeah, one day.
That was a fun few days.
Yeah, when I said it was easy,
Yeah.
don't put spaces in things.
Okay, so I've updated that, hopefully in just the 2 places that I needed to. I'll close that down. And what I'm going to do now is go back to the BCS page within the Admin Center and attempt to upload this model. So, no, sorry, wrong button. Still loading. BCS. Manage BDC models and external content types. And from here, I can either upload a BDC model or an external content type. In our case, it's an actual model. It's just whirling away. So I hit import and browse to that file that we were just working with, which is right here, Adventure Workzone Data. And I'll go with default options for everything else and import that. So just as when you upload a BDC model or an external content type to your on-premises BCS service, we go through this validation process. The only difference is if this fails and an error is presented and you get a correlation ID, it's much more difficult to troubleshoot because you obviously can't retrieve the logs behind that correlation ID in SharePoint Online. So this should just take a minute or so, if that. And one thing I'll show you whilst that is importing is back in the on-prem farm, the web config change that Neil mentioned, I'll show you where that is. So again, this is for the binding redirect against the secure store assemblies. And you can see here that we have old version of 16, new version 15. And that's the change that you need to make within the web config file for the web application that you're exposing through your reverse proxy device, so teamspo.hassani on-prem in my case. So hopefully, if we flip back over to this guy over here, we can see that the BDC model was successfully imported, which is good. So no troubleshooting required there. And if I go back to that page, I should see the model imported and the associated external content types now. Just wait for that to tick over. You can see we've got the model name of Adventure Workzone Data there, and we should see a couple of content types which were defined. I think there should be 3. So 4 actually. We've got address, customer address. Oh, what's going on there? Whoa. Don't know what happened there. Right, anyway, hopefully you saw a glimpse of those. So what I'm going to now do is over in one of my site collections within the tenancy, so you can see here with brightstardevelopment.sharepoint.com, I like to use a theme that allows me to remember where I'm working. So if we hit add an app, I'm going to go create an external list using that external content type that we just uploaded. So I think it's over here on the second page. Click external list. Give this a name of Ignite Customers and go through to the external content type picker. Sometimes this just takes a couple of seconds to render, and I'll choose customer there. So if I hit OK, click create, hopefully what we should see is this external list created using that external content type. So while that is going away and creating, it's already done it. If we go into that external list, we should see it immediately render the same list of customers that we saw within that list that I showed you at the start of the demonstration within the on-premises environment. While that is rendering, I'll just go back to the on-prem list and we can have a look at a particular record. So if we take this first record here, company name of a bike store, first name Neil, last name Guy. If I go back to the online list, still loading. Assuming it does render data correctly, we'll attempt to write back to that list and we'll see that change replicated both here in the list and within the on-premises version of the list. Oh, there we go. SharePoint Online's waking up. You see, you get the little spinner as you do in the on-prem environment. And there we go. We have our data consumed. Thank you. So what we'll now do is edit one of these items. So we'll go into Neil, record. And let's change this guy's name to Mr. Bob Fox. Save that. He doesn't look happy. And now we can see that that record's been updated, presented in the SharePoint Online site collection. We go back to the on-prem list and refresh that. You can see that it's also updated here too. And I could go into the SQL database at the back end and show you that as well, but I won't waste any more time on that. So just one final thing to show you, which might be of interest, is back in our SharePoint Online tenancy, we've already gone through the procedure of configuring inbound search. So, for example, if I just search for the word test, this is from my online search center. What it should do is present results locally from SharePoint Online and the site collections that I have access to, but also from the site collections that I have access to in the on-premises environment. It doesn't look like it's actually worked out. Let's try that another time. We've uncovered a little bug, which sometimes means you have to try this a couple of times.
Yeah.
Just wait for that second, otherwise I'll fix it while we go through the next set of
Third click will be
slides.
the winner.
Yeah.
One more time?
Yeah. That
Sure.
should do it.
There we go.
Yeah.
Third time lucky. So you can see here that I've got results from my on-premises web application, and this is why we had the two URLs configured within the alternate access mapping, so that although SharePoint Online is connecting on Team SPO, users will actually see results returned with team.hassanionprem.com, and then don't require that client certificate to be installed locally on their machines. They can just use Windows authentication. But also, what I do want to show you, which is quite interesting, is if we search for a particular term that we know is an external list, we actually see through hybrid search BCS results being returned from our on-premises environment. So that's quite cool, and this is obviously all out-of-the-box configuration, which is why display templates look a bit rubbish. But you could really build a rich application based on the scenario that Neil described earlier around that. Cool.
Okay. Thanks, Sam. Ooh, where's the button?
5.
So as we said, that was kind of the building blocks. So very simple configuration. There's obviously a lot more you can do with that in terms of exposing multiple pieces of data, in terms of configuring the look and feel to make it look much more like a mobile workforce application. Other things we can look at, we mentioned at the start that we were thinking about not just on-premises data, but what about Azure? Lots of customers these days, lots of our customers, lots of your customers are getting quite excited about the services in Azure. I think since Scott Guthrie took over, the momentum of change in Azure has been phenomenal, and the amount of things you can do up there is quite incredible. So one of the scenarios we want to look at as well is what do we do if we have our line of business data, or indeed any data, stored in an Azure SQL database, in a PaaS role in Azure where it's flexible and accessible, and we can do work with it in an Office 365 to Azure hybrid configuration. The scenario here, battery's running out. The scenario here is really quite similar to what we've already seen, except we're taking out the piece in the middle. We don't need that reverse proxy configuration anymore. We don't need that hybrid S2S trust configured anymore with our SharePoint Online site or our SharePoint Online tenant and our on-premises environment. Now it's fairly straightforward. Our users that are going to access the data, they hit the on-premises, the online application just in the same way they did before. The external list in this case is going to use online BCS, but instead of going through the reverse proxy to talk to a BCS instance on premises, it's actually going to go direct to SQL Azure. So we're going to expose data in SQL Azure. I think the demo we're going to try and show is using an OData service, as we'd expect, to front the data in SQL Azure, and then deliver that same kind of experience to expose line of business data through an external content type, maybe through an app, to get that experience of a truly immersive hybrid experience from an Azure perspective and SharePoint Online. The way we do it very straightforward, a lot of it's the same, right? So what we showed you before in terms of configuration, we go the same way. We create our SQL Azure database. We create an OData service on top of that. We then create our external content type, just in the same way Sam showed you, and we make that external content type tenant ready. Because we're going to use BCS services in Office 365, we need to go through the same process of ensuring that we can talk to our data source using the BCS services and not the traditional on-premises application. The same way as we did before, we create a secure store target application. This time, though, we're creating it in online. If you remember, Sam talked about 2 secure store target applications before. He talked about the one that we used to do the trust, or we used to present the pre-authentication certificate to the reverse proxy to allow our connections to go through from online to on-premises. In this case, and the second one he talked about was the one he used on-premises as the credential store to actually authenticate against the data source. In this case, we have a different one. We only need the one out in Office 365, but we're configuring one in Office 365 to do that authentication piece. We don't need the client pre-auth anymore. Then we upload the model in the same way as we did before, and then we go and validate the list and validate the data just in the same way Sam showed you before. So, fingers crossed.
Yeah, let's give that one a go. So, as Neil said, this time we're purely focusing on the cloud scenario. So we're not speaking back to our on-premises environment. What we have is an OData service that's being configured for, again, AdventureWorks database. And this OData service is actually hosted in Azure itself. And obviously, it's fronting a SQL Azure database, the AdventureWorks database. So we've got that URL there just to show you that there. So the first thing we need to do is create that secure store target application. And again, the purpose of this is to have the credential mapping to allow users that we want to be able to consume this feed to actually speak to the backend data source and use credentials that have permission to do so. So I'm going to call this Ignite Azure, just something that I can easily remember. Copy that to the clipboard. So this is effectively equivalent of what we had on-prem as OData app. And I can give these labels any name that I want, but I'm going to go with standard username and password as the field types, because I don't want to upload a certificate this time. I actually want to specify the credentials for that OData service for the account that has access to it. So hit OK. I've added my member of test, which is the user that we're logged in as. And I'll go ahead and set the credentials. And this is where I'll enter the service account credentials effectively. And this is the account details there. So S. Hassani and the password. So I'll hit OK. And there we go. We've got the target application created. So similarly to before, what we now need to do is manage connections to our online services. And again, the process is a little bit similar. There's not quite as much detail that you need to specify. All we really need to do is specify that secure store target application and the service endpoint that we want to speak to. So again, I'll give this the same name, and I'll get the service address from my notepad here. I could have got it from the browser, actually. I'll take that guy out, so the Azure endpoint, and put it in there. And then I've selected that I want to use credentials stored in SharePoint, and I can just, that's the wrong name in there. The secure store target application had the same name of Ignite Azure. And I'll paste that in there. So now we need to take an external content type, just as we did before, and it has the same structure as the external content type, or the BDCM that I showed you earlier. And again, we just need to specify the OData connection setting ID. So I'm just going to plonk it in here. There's 2 locations for it, so down at the bottom here too. Okay, again, hopefully no spelling mistakes. I'll save that, close it down, and back into BCS, go ahead and attempt to upload this content type. Much the same process as earlier, where once we do specify the file that we want to upload, and find it, which is this guy here. It will go through the import process, the validation process, and then once it has been hopefully successfully uploaded, we should be able to create an external list off of it.
Fingers crossed.
Yep. So fingers crossed. The
okay. You have to do a song.
Yeah. That dreaded 12% state.
Yeah, that's the authentication stage.
It's usually where, once you get past that, you're usually okay. So probably jinxed it now, but there we go.
Good.
Successfully imported. So back over to my site, and I'll be able to create an external list from that content type. So go in here and call it Ignite Azure. This time, when I launch the content type picker, I should see the previous content types that we uploaded that point back to our data source on-prem, and the new content type that we just uploaded, which is sales order details from the data source AW Azure. I'll select that guy, hit OK, and that should go away and create the external list. And again, we should be able to consume that data, read that data, and also update and create new records too. How are we doing for time?
Just about.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, click on it.
Yeah, it's just SharePoint Online really, really slow for some reason.
You can't say that.
You can't say that.
We're two Microsoft guys.
There you go.
There we go. Oh, it's not even created it. Okay. Go ahead and create. Wake up. Okay, that was a little quicker creating anyway. So here we go, Ignite Azure. So this time we should see different data set, obviously from a different source. So these are sales records. And once they're pulled through, there you go. Here's our data coming through from Azure. But as well as being able to read that data, we want to be able to do something useful with it, so we should be able to update these records too. So I'll go ahead and modify the unit price to quadruple 4, save that, and all being well, it should write back. If it's not successful, you'd normally see a pretty horrible error at that point, but we can see that that has written and updated that item.
Okay, thanks, Sam. So the interesting... Great job. So the interesting thing before we go back to the content is we've seen external content types. External content types have been around for a while, but these days everyone wants an app, right? We don't want to be downloading files and creating external lists in SharePoint. We want to do it easy. We want to find a published app that we can just consume, install on our site collection or install on our site, and just use the data there in the same way. So all being well, Manas is going to go through the app side of the configuration and the deployment.
Thank you, Neil. So, guys, how many of you do apps on a regular basis? Wow. Okay. So I will take a step back because I don't do that. But the entire intention of going ahead and doing this was how easy it is to go out and consume the same data that Sam has been talking about and kind of build an app along with the navigation using our regular Visual Studio and just kind of go ahead and use the same data. So what you see on the screen right now is the OData source, and here is the site which which we are trying to go ahead and use on SharePoint Online. And the entire concept behind this is your data is in on-prem, and you're trying to go ahead and leverage an app within the site collection so that you should be able to go ahead and consume and modify that. Pretty much simple Visual Studio steps. You do File, New, and Project. Choose App for SharePoint. Give it some name. Bob's app. That's the name. So after that, the next thing which you need to do is where do you want this app to be published? Because Bob being the, specifically looking into the data, he would want to see all of the customers that Sam was mentioning about. So here is my SharePoint site collection, which I have. It's a out-of-box private site collection with a developer template. I'm saying SharePoint hosted app. As I say that, it would actually go ahead and authenticate in the background. It would prompt you, but in interest of time, we have already gone ahead and saved the credentials for this. This is pretty much what you would need in case you have gone ahead and got the data and got the credentials part of it stored within your Visual Studio application. Okay? But we always want to do a couple of things extra so that the app looks like an app, and you do not come back and tell, okay, Manas developed that app, so I want to look at it a little nicer. What I do is I'll try to go ahead and build a navigation, a small set of information within the placeholder.main section of this. And if I can look at that, just replace this with, and I would try to just go ahead and give me a minute.
To add the constant type.
Yes. The other thing which I'd want to go ahead and show within this, before even going ahead and placing it within the placeholder.main section, is I right now do not have any of the content types which shows up here. Okay, so I'm going to go to this app and click on Add and get the content types from my external data source. Okay, it would say which URL is where your content types and this data is present. Okay, here is the URL which I was showing you in a browser. You specify that, you give it a name, SPOCT, something like that. When you click on Next, it's going to go ahead and go back to that data and show you the details around each of those content types. I have customers, employees, end users, all of them. Well, do I need all this information? Well, yes for this. And then it says create list instances for the selected data entities. Build that. Okay. What you see right now is it has populated the entire information out here. Okay. Next thing, just because I did not complete building the navigation part of it, if you go to default.aspx, okay, which is where I was at, you just go back and place the same navigation part which I was referring to before publishing this content type. That's pretty much what you need to do. Go back and try to deploy this app, and hopefully that should get deployed. If not, that secures my job because I will be able to go back and look into what was the error, get the information, and kind of say, okay, this is what was broken, and kind of take it from there. It's trying to do it, as you see on the screen, and we'll give it a couple of minutes. Last time we tried it, it took like 2 minutes to do that. And I'll wait and see how it goes.
So while the app's deploying, is there any questions
Yes.
anyone wants to shout out while we're waiting for the app? One across the way.
And okay, there's a question.
One question regarding the app. What we will see now is that we have an external list inside the app web. The question is, how can I get this into the search index?
Oh. So the question is, how do we get the content of the app web into the search index? Today, that's not possible.
Yes.
The app web's not navigable by the crawler, so that's not going to happen. I suggest you possibly speak to someone in the search team. There's a session on vNext search on Wednesday, so they may be able to answer your questions there. But today, that's certainly something that's not possible, but it is a common request. So your other scenario, I guess, is to not crawl the app web, but use the method that Sam talked about earlier, where he's using the BDC crawl effectively, going around to get the data that way. That's the only option you have viable today. Yep. Two people down here will from the search team will be able to help you, I think.
Okay.
Just
Thanks, Neil.
finish the wrap.
And the app got deployed. So what I do is I'll try to refresh the page. And I have an app which, if you see here, that's Bob's app, which you'd want to go back and look into and see the information. And it has the navigation which I was talking about, customer and employee. Great looking. I would never, I mean to say, okay, though I developed it, I typically not go out and want to look into it that dull an app, but yeah, it does have a navigation. So if we click into that, it tries to go out and pull that information again, like what Sam was trying to go out and show us. And here is the information, right, which is pretty much going ahead and getting deployed, pulled up from an app. You would be able to go ahead and get a new item created on this. Employee ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, something like that. Manager ID. And as I pull in the rest of the information, I should be able to go ahead and save that information back. So it saved it. Because it did not throw that error, you guys will have to go ahead and believe that it saved that information, and here is it. So if you scroll down. So that's how it's as simple as you build an app, deploy it, pull the information, kind of move around with that app and get to store the same set of data.
Okay.
Over to Neil.
Thanks, Manas. Good job. So with that, we hope we've given you some ideas about BCS, and it can be a supremely powerful capability in hybrid scenarios, both in on-premises and in 365, and as we saw with Sam's development work with Azure. So the scenarios, the takeaways, as we said, we hope we've delivered you at least something to appreciate those. There is one last thing we want to leave you with, really, and that's for any of you that are interested in joining the SharePoint Server TAP program, so for vNext bits, please reach out, come and see us, go to the TAP booth down in the expo hall. Please speak to those guys, and there's some guys at the back of the room over here, Bob and Brian, who are on that program, and they can help you out get hooked up there for on-prem bits. So with that done, if we have any more questions, we'll be happy to take them.